All right, very good.
Yeah.
Are we all here? So we have Greg is somewhere. Yes, Greg is there. Okay, very good. I think we can get going because we don't have the whole afternoon. Welcome everyone to virtual York University, as it were. I'm Stefan Kipfer. I'm a professor at York in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Welcome to the first panel in the 2021-2022 edition of the Global South Forum, which is an annual lecture series co-sponsored by a number of institutions at York University, the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, the graduate and undergraduate programs in Development Studies and African Studies, the York Center for Asian Research, and the Department of Politics. Later in this year, late in the winter term, we're going to have at least another 2 of these panels, and we will send announcements about those. Coming up, there will be, for example, a panel on Bandung, the Bandung conference at some point in April. So stay tuned for that. We'll send out the details once we have them. Now, in some sense, this panel is also returning us to a discussion that we had in our faculty a couple of years ago about planning for a different society. And indeed, some of our colleagues here on the panel were part of that panel 2 years ago, which was then a part of a seminar series organized by our colleague Luisa Sotomayor. So we're kind of returning to that theme, but focused specifically on the experience of Kerala in southern India. So why Kerala? Well, maybe I should just sort of lay that out personally, because I proposed this session a few months ago when I heard this summer that the book People's Planning was re-edited and republished this year. I thought, well, okay, let's try and discuss it for a number of reasons. First of all, because we had heard in various parts of the world last year what Kerala was doing with respect to responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it seemed as if there were some important lessons on the health front that we could discuss in other parts of the world. And so immediately that was one of my personal reasons why we thought we should bring that back. But of course, there's a number of larger issues that make us want to revisit the Kerala experience, which has been debated, of course, quite a bit over the last 20, 25 years. It is a case that wants us to consider the meaning of planning in an imperial context, right? In a context defined by an imperialist world order. It is a case that is particularly important to discuss today, given the rise of fascism in various parts of the world, including, of course, in India. What does it mean for moderate but nonetheless democratic and social democratic socialist initiatives to develop in that context? There is the question of participation, of course. For some of us here in our faculty, many of our students are particularly interested in the question of participation and planning. And as this example shows us, that can mean many different things, including contradictory things, politically and socially. And certainly that is another reason to revisit the decentralization strategies developed in Kerala. And finally, I think it's perhaps useful to return to Kerala because of current debates about the meaning of socialism in the 21st century, right? Much of the debate about Kerala took place in that context, also in conversation with Latin America in particular. And so it perhaps is useful for us to reconsider the meaning of 21st century socialism in 2021, as opposed to in 2000 or 2010. So lots to debate, and our panelists will, I'm sure, touch on some of those and many other issues as we move forward. So we have a very simple format. We're going to go in alphabetical order, and each speaker will I have about 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes to make some observations about people's planning and about Kerala more broadly speaking in historical or theoretical context. And then hopefully we'll have a good half hour to discuss amongst ourselves as well with the audience. And that'll be bringing us to 2 o'clock this afternoon. So without further ado, the first speaker on the list is Professor Greg Albo, who is in the Department of Politics at York University, and who's also well known for being one of the editors of the Socialist Register, and one of the editors of the Bullet, which many of you are hit by on a daily basis, as it were, in the electronic world of news distribution. So, Greg, floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks for organizing this and for the seminar on the Global South that's meeting this over the year. There's been a lot of great seminars by it. The experience of Kerala is, I think, relatively little known outside of South Asia, and little discussed as an alternative in terms of planning, participatory planning, and alternative economic development. Obviously, there's some discussion, extensive discussion in developmental journals, but it's very little found within the socialist publications of the West. Monthly Review and Socialist Register are about the only two publications that have had substantive articles on Kerala, and also covered some of the developments there in the general articles that are dealing with Indian politics and Indian development. This book by Isaac and Franke is on people's planning in Kerala in both editions. The older one, which I have, is very good. I haven't really checked through the new one, but it's a very engaging history of the decentralized democracy project with the associated improvement in social provisioning and state planning capacities, and it is a very interesting discussion as well of the alternative strategic direction that the CPIM in India took, and its fusion with civil society. I think it's a really great extension or complement to the older book by Michelle Williams on participatory democracy, democratic communists in Kerala and South Africa, which he's kind of continued to write on over the year. They're kind of very complementary books, looking at it, one coming from inside India to some extent, and Michelle's, having a comparative context and being built around a lot of extensive field research and interviews and sitting in on the participatory planning issues. I think what is addressed here is the central political economic challenge from the 19th century on, in a way, especially the challenge that was posed after World War II, addressing underdevelopment in the world market and overturning the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, and building democratic capacities over politics and economic life amongst the popular classes. The strategies adopted, began that process in quite a diverse range. There was, of course, the U.S. built institutions of Bretton Woods and the U.S.-led strategy, the stages of economic growth that we all learned as undergraduates, or just by observing closely American policies: build markets, protect property rights, support multinational corporations, and steadily liberalize economic and political activities over time. State planning, to the extent it existed, was about market building, and most planning was occurring in the major corporations through vertically integrated internationalizing MNCs was the focal point. That was opposed in a way, particularly as it came out of the post-war period, with the Soviet-centered conceptions of catch-up and development. Statist, collectivist command systems centered initially on building heavy industry and infrastructure, and squeezing consumer and agricultural goods production. That was complemented extensively, was accommodated in the GATT system and the initial Bretton Woods institutions by various schemes of import substitution industrialization built on extractive sector exports, that the surplus is being earned from extractive sector exports being then used to diversify industrial production, typically in low value added goods, but diversifying from there. The other option, accommodated by the U.S. in East Asia, was an export-oriented strategy focused on taking advantage of very large labor surpluses, building out from low value-added production and manufacturing, and state-guided support for building up to higher value-added industries. There was also a fifth kind of alternative that was there, and that was found in the more inward-oriented, self-reliant orientations in the two demographically huge countries, China and India. Those were two distinct paths, two distinct forms of planning, with the obvious difference of one beginning that process of an alternative through a revolutionary break with the old state structure, and the other through a long process and struggle for decolonization, but much of the old state structure remaining intact. To a great degree, the period of neoliberalism has seen a squeezing out of these alternatives, except for the long-standing American pole of development, market-led pole, consolidated in a sense by the various programmatic dimensions of the Washington Consensus, as descriptively well laid out by John Williamson, and then its various mutations since, often leading now to forms of authoritarian nationalism, attempts to build export-oriented strategies, and following the kind of recent edicts of development orientations from the World Bank, trying to fit within global value chains, and fit within the new kind of world order created by the Washington Consensus, including the kind of the trade structures of the WTO, and squeezing out completely of that any notions of popular participation. I think it must be said from the beginning that many of these projects, when governed by the left, either by the left nationalisms of import substitution industrialization, or the leftist projects coming through the communist systems, were a form of left productivism, focused on economic catch-up. Best captured by Stalin's comments after the war, that to the West, that we will bury you, with having the meaning of kind of the industrial catch-up will continue. This evolution was pushed to the side. Eventually, the coexistence of alternative development projects were marginalized. I think there are some experiments and developments, experiences in this time period that still bear note, and they bear note in relationship to how we evaluate Kerala and how we evaluate the history of planning through the 20th century. The experiments in popular auditing and governance with improved social provisioning that took place, and one have to concede, took place both in the communist dominated societies and in the key social democratic states in the Nordic zones. There was also some successes in the indicative planning processes, and particularly also with the planning utilizing state banks within capitalist economies, notably the French case. These also typically involve some measure of sectoral coordination occurring with this, Occasionally, not always, but occasionally, this also was coincided with the workers' plans coming forward out of the union movement or out of the left parties and pushing against these structures. One would have to concede that there were some successes also in these. There was, more localized experiments that were interesting and particularly parallel to some of the issues that arise when looking at Kerala. And that is the participatory planning experiences, cities like Bologna, London for a period under the Greater London Council, Barcelona at different points in time. A range of cities that you can point to, even at times, certain much more localized and much less generalized. Some of the experiences of more participation in planning structures within the North American case. There were also the cases that there's some continual reflection in the less developed countries in the post-colonial states attempting to find alternative development plans. In Tanzania and Mozambique, and their initial break from the colonial powers, developed a range of interesting participatory community development nodes with mixed success, but they were experiments that bear some relationship and bear some thinking in relationship to Kerala. And also one would have to point to the continued struggles over the communal system in Venezuela as also a terrain of continual struggle over different forms of participatory planning. I think Kerala's decentralized democracy stands out within this context as one of the zones of concerted effort and sustained developmental alternative. Less productivist, less market-centered, and incorporating some of Marx's conception of human development, workers changing, the producers changing both their circumstances and themselves in a process of class struggle against existing institutions and social relations. I think that is when you read this book and you read Michelle's book, I think that's what you particularly gain, that story of a less productivist focus and a more participatory focus, and the way it is changing both institutions and circumstances through the intense political climate that is Kerala. There is, I think, several notable aspects of the People's Campaign for Democratic Decentralization. The mass extension of the state to local tiers of government of power, power over decision making, direct controls over planning, budgets, administration. So some really on the ground, concrete attempts to build in consistent participation. So something that goes away that has often been fashionable on the left about the Porto Alegre process in Brazil. Kerala goes well beyond that process in terms of participation, and going back to some of the old communist and social democratic experiments, builds in forms of popular and continual auditing of the implementation process. It's also an important dimension that's an important dimension of the struggle over the terrain of the state that's present. I think the effort by both the state and the party to extend mass participation in local assemblies articulated to the more developed planning structures, and that consistency over time, decades now process is also an important feature there. The effectiveness of these processes in housing, social provisioning, the relative successes in the public health struggles over the pandemic, its support for smaller production units and co-ops and villages is undeniable, and particularly stands up well with so many of the other states, subnational states in India. In building, and what's striking is building a tighter block between civil society organizations and the party, seen obviously in the recent re-election of the left front in the local elections, standing now as the only left government existing in India. And that's standing against the swamp and the pressures and the ideological fighting that's been coming from the Modi government and the BJP. So it's an important kind of stance of a political kind of development. Others will have to speak than me, who know the territory and terrain much better than I about its Gramscian conceptions and components, but it is an interesting case to study on that grounds as well. I think it has to be said, there are still profound limits of what's also unfolded in Kerala. There's obviously still, we're dealing still with a capitalist state in an overwhelmingly capitalist national state structure, which lends itself, given the inevitable coordinations between levels of the state, but also inside the state, of a certain kind of bureaucratic dominance. That bureaucratic dominance comes from the twofold: the need to pool resources at some central point, so they can also be dispersed to kind of equalize participation and resources between very unequal units and village levels of development. But also speaking to the unequal participation in an unequal society. There is the problem of scale. Local scales are always embedded, encompassing world market pressures, and these wider scales undermine local development and local capacities. There is little evidence that hasn't impacted the trajectory of development in Kerala and stunted it to some extent. It is an aspect that's there, and the wider kind of scalar development that mediated by the national state has been consistently pushing in the direction of neoliberalism. So it's more difficult at this local scale to offset that. And of course, that has come with increasing inequalities and shifting class structures inside Kerala, not only, of course, what's occurring across India as a whole. Let me just wrap with these points on I think what are important lessons from Kerala and the elaboration in the Isaac and Frank text for us all. One, I think it really captures something that we need to struggle against, and a certain kind of wistfulness about a return of the state at this moment, and a certain state idolatry that's been emerging, particularly as China becomes a challenge to the U.S. At best, this is reflection of a certain left productivism and a hope for an non-U.S.-centered world order. That's at best what it is. At worst, it's about rival capitalism, increased competition, and the increasing competition will come from the increasing circulation of Chinese capital on the world stage, and therefore not at all a break from the models of growth and development that we need to deal with global warming and the levels of inequalities we face. The other thing is, I think it puts central the importance of human development, changing circumstances and changing ourselves. What W.E.B. Du Bois put in terms of the double consciousness in the struggle for equality. I think, that's kind of the thematic theme that I would take from the text and the Kerala experience. I think I'll just speak more concretely about particular projects in North America and Europe in this context. There's lessons here about political agency and the need to encourage and develop new forms of political party that are actively engaged in struggle in civil society, that go beyond any particular coalition and so forth, that kind of can take on the terrain of the state. You can't read these books or the experience or the increase of participation without taking that as central to what occurred. I think there's also important lessons about the concrete struggles we need to take everywhere on to deal with climate change and equalizing development. Part of that has come from the Green New Deals about transition. But some of this is around economic conversion and the need for workers' plans that kind of develop alternatives from the producers themselves. It's also about the need for local development to connect to social provisioning, such as public health or public transit, and so on. So I think the final thing I would say about this, not only about those social provisioning, what's so important in the Kerala experience and the longevity of it, and when the left front isn't been in power and the opposition has been in power, it has been difficult to overturn some of the restructuring of that has occurred inside the state, and inside the state dealing with the makings of an alternative and more participatory administration. And that is so much the challenge we face everywhere in the world, to find new forms of democratic administration and accountability that not only are delivering redistributive policies, but are finding new mechanisms for popular participation and equalizing development. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me, Stefan.
Thanks so much, Greg. Lots of things to debate, many insights. Next, we have Professor Ranu Basu, who is a geographer and who is also now a member in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York. Professor Basu has done extensive research on social policy and urban questions, including education in Toronto, as well as in Calcutta and in other parts of India, as well as in Cuba. So Ranu, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me, Stefan?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much again for this invitation and to share some very basic insights on the readings of this book. Before beginning, I wanted to start as this week we have witnessed the culmination of the power of collective action and the victory of Indian farmers and agricultural workers across India. With Prime Minister Narendra Modi backing off and repealing the farm laws that were primarily geared towards the benefit of corporations and global capitalism. The price paid was high. The extraordinary number of farmer suicides, the levels of increasing death, poverty, and despair, escalating social polarization of wealth, religious fanatism, violence against peaceful protests, and misrepresentation by the corporate media, all during the midst of a global pandemic ravaging the country, was confronted with political determination and the spirit of struggle and resistance by the masses. The struggle against neoliberal globalization has paved the way once again for these kinds of renewed discussions. So against the violence of this background, there is then the example of Kerala and its political counter-narrative, which is what this book is about. Kerala, a state with 35 million people in the southwest coastal peninsula of India, recently this May re-elected the Left Democratic Front, the LDF, for another 5 years, but is also, as Greg mentioned, part of Indian capitalism, an economy that is today more market-oriented and integrated with the neoliberal world economy. Since the 1970s, Kerala's numerous political parties have functioned largely within two coalitions: the left of center Left Democratic Front, the LDF, that was led by the Communist Party of Indian Marxists, that's the CPM, and the right of center United Democratic Front, the UDF, led by the Congress Party. And the two fronts have alternated in holding power. Now, People's Planning, Kerala Democracy, Local Democracy and Development by Thomas Isaac and Richard Franke provides us an alternative socialist paradigm of planning and development within the limitations of this Indian federalism. It was originally published in 2000 with its second edition this year. It's really a fascinating study of the state of Kerala's, the vision, the history, and experimentation in decentralized planning. but a decentralization that emerged within a particular social political context. That's important to keep in mind. Democratic decentralization, as noted in the preface of the book, was part of a larger struggle for self-reliance through mass participation, and is based on decades of struggle of ordinary people for a better life. Kerala was not considered an economically advanced state until the 1990s, when the per capita income was lower than the national average. Today, it prides itself as having the highest wage in the country. The original Kerala model is derived from the state's favorable indicators in almost every category of public health and health infrastructure. It is worth noting that Kerala is far ahead of India in almost all of its indicators, with an HDI value of 0.79, a literacy rate of 94, where India's rate is 67, life expectancy of 74, with India is 63.5, and an infant mortality rate of 12, where India's is 50. Female literacy is 92% against India's, 65. So during the past few years, the LDF, the Left Democratic Front, has confronted a number of crises. It's important to keep in mind as to why it was reelected. And in 2017, there was the after effects of the cyclone Ochi, the Nipah virus outbreak in 2018, the floods in 2018 and 19, and then 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic. It is credited to have been able to handle these various situations, given the robust public infrastructure in place, many a result of the decentralization efforts of the People's Party campaign, the PPC. So 25 years ago, in 1996, Kerala launched the People's Planning Campaign, PPC, which mobilized over 3 million people in villages and neighborhoods across the state, and continues to be regarded as one of the most successful experiments in decentralization. The book brings together theory and detailed observation in the analysis of the process of decentralization of governance, whether projects of mutual aid, cooperatives, grassroots organizations, and engages with alternative workings of anti-capitalist perspective towards social transformation. The primary motivations of the PPC, it notes, was to promote Kerala's radical history and tradition, where active participation of all people involved in the decision-making process would contribute towards their empowerment as active political subjects. Thomas Isaac, one of the authors, oversaw the PPC and served as the Minister of Finance for 2 terms under the LDF between 2006 and 11 and 2016 and 2021. He was also previously professor at the Center of Development Studies at Thiruvananthapuram. So over 15 chapters, the first part of the book documents the general background and rationale for the campaign, Kerala's long history of social mobilization and struggle, and the critical role of leadership of EMS Nambudripad, the communist politician and theorist who served as the first Chief Minister of Kerala in 1957 to 59, and again in 1967 to 69. As Chief Minister, EMS, as he was known, was committed to socialist ideals and pioneered numerous radical reforms in Kerala, whether it related to land reform, education, and social welfare, and had a vision which formed the ideological and structural basis of the PPC that was to follow. EMS had headed the campaign and stated, in his words, PPC is the most radical development that has taken place in Kerala since the attainment of independence, the formation of the state of Kerala, and land reforms. The second part of the book explores 6 different phases of the PPC, from the process of identifying needs, collecting data, formulating local proposals, plans, while the third part explores the importance of institutionalism, internationalism, implementation, and finally concludes with a reflection of 25 years of the PPC. So what were some of the distinctive features of Kerala's decentralization? What were some of the big ideas, methods used, and challenges faced? So I'd just like to present 4 conceptual directives, guided by some of my work also in Cuba, which resonates closely on many levels with the ideological principles and practices of the Kerala project. So these are some of the 4 conceptual directives. First is the principles of solidarity and mass participation, where a mobilized society, particularly marginalized and subaltern, is able to engage with the state through institutionalized forms of participation. Second, creating, and particularly in relation to educational spaces, creating spaces of socialist ideology, pedagogy, and praxis in order to raise consciousness. So consciousness raising towards socialist ideals, human dignity and rights, not only aspiration for themselves, but also for future generation. Third is to the state intervention and the scalar politics of redistribution, a sort of social commitment to redistributive justice, right from the central to the local governance. And finally, the politics of care, the challenging gender and caste relations, particularly looking at the example of Kudumdustri. And Kudumdustri is a really very interesting example, which I'll end the talk with. So just briefly, some examples from the book, drawing on these kinds of principles. The first based on principles of solidarity and mass participation. As I mentioned earlier, where mobilized society, particularly marginalized subaltern, is able to engage with the state through institutionalized forms of participation. So the book outlines sort of 4 principles. First is that the decentralization requires changes in administrative structure, allocation of functions, and powers and control of resources, and to be done simultaneously rather than incrementally. Second, it notes planning as an instrument of social mobilization. Very interesting, as the main objective of the PPC was to empower the LGS, the local governmental structures, to draw plans in participatory and transparent manner without compromising the technical standards. And what is interesting here is the insistence of mass participation and transparency. So ordinary people assembling in Grama Sabhas were to be part of this process. So rather than looking at planning as a technical process that involves assessment of needs, etc., in Kerala, it's also an instrument of social mobilization in support of decentralization. The purpose here is to also bring forth attitudinal changes among participants and mass pressure from below for democratic reforms. And this sense of attitudinal changes is particularly very important in the Indian context. Third is creating a new civic culture. Civic and political engagement is very central. So rather than a bureaucratic departmental approach, it has given way to a democratic vision. And this is challenging as there needs to be a transformation in the mindset, again, attitudes and mindset of elected local representatives. And so they note the ultimate aim of decentralization is to provide maximum opportunity for the direct participation of people towards daily governance. And finally, fourth, how did one maintain the sustainability of the movement so that it endured over time? That's a big challenge. This would require institutionalizing it within the legal and administrative system. So it would require sustained mass pressure from below to secure the necessary structural changes. And this is the institutionalization is particularly important. And as we can see both here in Kerala and also in Cuba. Coming down to the question of creating spaces of socialist ideology, pedagogy, and praxis in terms of consciousness rating towards social ideals, human dignity and rights, aspirations for themselves and future generations, we can use the example of educational spaces, and this is a subject that I study as well. This requires the complete transformation of the school system, which as one of the primary goals. And it reminds me of the Cuban literacy campaign movement after the 1959 revolution, where the role of education in raising political consciousness, which was imperialist and anti-colonialist education, was very critical in the empowerment of the population. Many parallels to the role and function of the literacy campaign in Kerala, where volunteers come forward and literacy centers are set up across the state. In Kerala, post-decentralization period witnessed a remarkable improvement in school infrastructure, whether it was building, toilets, drinking water, curriculum reform, training of teachers, collecting indicators and monitoring progress, school feeding programs, biodiversity gardens, talent competition, etc., to empower the masses. And the book, not just one chapter, but the book is scattered with examples of this kind of pedagogical initiatives throughout the campaign and historically to the present. And what is really interesting, another really interesting point is much of the infrastructural costs are drawn from the KIIFB, the Kerala Infrastructure Investment Fund Board, which is a new financial institution. And much of the resources and or money from that, aside from coming from the central government, 50% come from motor vehicle taxes. Third, the state intervention and the scalar politics of redistribution are based on social commitment towards redistributive justice, right from the central to the local governance. So why should demands be decentralized, they query? So there was a growing recognition that the geographical variations and local specificities were very critical in the local governance of communities. Localities were best able to determine their own priorities and develop their own political culture. Therefore, the project of decentralization of planning took these contextual differentiations where the role of civil society, public space, and the public sphere were all very significant. The Kerala model discusses the redistributive paradigm, right from the agrarian movement to collective bargaining and redistributive strategy. So I'm going to end with just the focus on the quality of a couple of services, local infrastructure and production sectors, right from education that I talked about, health, drinking water, local level micro watershed managements and sanitation and roads, focus on housing and energy, and of course, production through agriculture and small scale industries. There were very similar initiatives like education in public health, and the creation of a very robust health infrastructure proved invaluable, particularly during the outbreak of COVID-19. Local governments were active in the prevention and control of infectious diseases and disaster management, where flooding took place twice. So during COVID-19, they had the institutional structures in place, for example, identifying quarantine centers, sanitation, care for the aged and the chronically ill. And at this time, India was experiencing, again, very important, a mass exodus of migrants on foot across the country during the lockdown, when buses and trains were shut down. So unlike the rest of the country, in Kerala, local centers were able to establish temporary camps for migrant workers in less than 3 days and provide food through community kitchens. The Minister of Health and Social Welfare, K.K. Shailaja, interestingly credits the Cuba as inspired health model during the pandemic and when family health centers were started. And finally, the politics of care, challenging gender and caste relations, an example of Kudam Dashri. So as a poverty eliminating program, Kudam Dashri, Kudam meaning family and Shri meaning prosperity, is a major source of employment for women, 50%. They provide subsidies and interest-free loans and has led to the social and political empowerment of over 45 lakh women and their families. Occupation and small entrepreneurships such as Ayurvedic products, bags, auto drivers are all sorts of initiatives. And based on its popularity has been modeled in 6 other states in India and even abroad in Ethiopia and South Africa. So through these numerous examples, we learn to see how in the book, we learn to see how PPC aligns itself against exploitation and towards empowerment of the masses towards social change. There's lots of challenges, of course, and Greg mentioned many of these, but the forces of globalization and reform, of course, Kerala, like Cuba, has embraced market reforms and greater privatization and sought foreign investments. The book mentions a couple of the challenges, such as increase in privatization, the public sector, decline in participation, corruption, questions of sustainable development, and also very important, the balance between growth with welfare. So achievements in the social sector have not necessarily resulted in comparative progress with the economic sector. So now the focus is on the economy in recent years and building of infrastructure such as roads and bridges. And further, the pandemic has resulted in the productivity of losses. So Kerala is attempting to change the economic base to knowledge-based industries, technology and skill-based, and investing in an IT industry, particularly based on the state's high literacy rates. So to conclude, social transformation must be accomplished through multiple struggles on multiple fronts, all linked but each distinct, as shown in the Kerala example of Kerala. The variety of local experiments from the campaign, and there's a whole host of them that are explicated in great detail in the book, are examples of concrete social transformations, whether through political participation, empowerment and autonomy, capacity building, improvement in the material conditions of life, or larger structural transformation based on a collective ideology of change. And I'll end with a quote from the book. Democratic decentralization is a political act. The political strategy of decentralization creates conditions for releasing mass initiatives for development and carrying out the broadest possible spectrum of development experiments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ranu. Very clear overview and lots of things to think about also strategically speaking. So moving right into the third presentation, which will be by Professor Kanishka Gunawardena, who is an architect by training, but has been teaching and researching in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto for some time now. Kanishka has been researching and publishing widely on Marxist theory, on radical urban theory, as well as on nationalism and populism, notably in his home country, Sri Lanka. So Kanishka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. It's always a pleasure to be with my comrades from York University, which I think is an important place in the project of socialism for the 21st century. And I say a place, not just a platform, as we speak in Zoom. And I thank, for these two great presentations from Greg and Ranu, especially in the case of Ranu, especially based on her own research and work, in India, Cuba, and places like that. One of the side effects of listening to such a wonderful presentation is that it makes much of my prepared little script redundant. So because Ranu's kind of presentation of the book is very lucid and compelling, and she has laid out the context in a very helpful way. Following Greg's introduction. So I'm trying to kind of change my plan a little bit and avoid the repetition. And also I understand we only have time till 2 p.m., right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we can go beyond, technically speaking, okay. But
I'll keep it.
We risk losing people. So the shorter, the better in some respects at this point. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll try to keep it short. Okay, so and I'll try to keep it a little bit impressionistic, and and I'm here trying to speak as somebody who's always been in some way interested in and committed to the socialist and Marxist tradition, but also as somebody who teaches planning, right, for my day job. So there's something. So planning and communism for me has always had a very fundamental and interesting relationship. So in the great classical conceptions of communism from Marx, there's a very particular understanding of the state and what happens to the state in revolution and after, right? So particularly the concept of the withering away of the state as almost a definition, of communism in the Marxist tradition. Right? Which means, some conception of, socialism or communism understood as, power to the people, right? And so this, is also connected to the very hotly debated notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. What happens to the state immediately after the revolution, in the Marxist tradition. And so Marx and Engels actually himself said once that, if you want to understand what the dictatorship of the proletariat is, look at the Paris Commune, right? And then, Lenin wrote a book about this called State and Revolution, on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, where he returned to this notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but also especially to the notion of the withering away of the state. And in that book too, as a planner, I've always been fascinated by, okay, what happens to the state and the role of planning precisely in the withering away of the state, right? And of course, we know from the history of the actually existing socialisms of the 20th century that this withering away of the state didn't work out exactly as planned, right? To put it briefly, so and within the Marxist tradition also, there has been a great deal of thought about this. So including by some people that, I and Stefan and some of us have engaged, such as Henri Lefebvre, so in his writings on the state, this notion of autogestion, right? Or self-management. So so when we talk about decentralization and democracy, we are kind of talking about a very, central, political question, that the Marxist and communist tradition has grappled with for over a century, right? And there have been various attempts to deal with these problems and challenges. And I think, it is with reference to that global left history that I, approach, the Kerala experience, and everything that has been said about it, right? So I just want to one thing I wanted to do, if nothing else, was to put our discussion in that broader context, right? But coming down to some of the sort of the specifics of the Kerala experience, so we are obviously talking about a situation that is quite different from the Paris Commune or even the Soviet Union. So we are talking about, as Greg and Ranu clarified, an attempt by communists elected to a state government to give power to the people, basically, right? It's not just decentralization of administration, but a devolution of political power, to the masses, the people, ordinary people, following the idea of, C.L.R. James and also Lenin, that every cook can govern, right? But this process unfolds under very specific circumstances in Kerala. Okay, it is within the framework of a state, that is actually like a hybrid mishmash of the colonial state, set up by Britain, and some elements of the socialist planning kind of state planning kind of state, or the welfare state, which was also significantly influenced by very centralized liberal progressive but very centralized institutions such as the Planning Commission, that sort of laid out the policy framework and direction for post-independence or post-colonial planning in India, right? So the whole experiment is also to be understood, the whole experience is also to be understood as a kind of an attempt to kind of break away from a very strongly established state structure. It's a federal state, but it's a highly centralized administrative system. And so first half of the book is really about the attempts to the long, attempts, from the 48, 47 onwards, to especially starting in the 50s, with the election of EMS Namboodiripad from the CPIM, to kind of not simply decentralize administration, but to devolve political power, right? So this is a long story, right? But it is, so the most striking thing is that it is the pursuit of the great, classical ambition of communism, withering away of the state, but pursued under very challenging and, non-socialist circumstances, right? So this, forces the Kerala communists, among others, I think, to deal with the reality of the state, even the reality of existing institutions of parliamentary democracy. So here, I think I want to, I'm very happy that Ranu mentioned EMS Namboodiripad, who's a visionary figure in all of this, and he's he's very brilliant and prolific writer, although mostly in Malayalam, but Leftward has published a few of his works, which I strongly urge people to consult in these kinds of discussions. But he said, he was a kind of laid out, I think the interesting way. I just want to read one passage from the book, the sort of the situation under they were operating, right? So according to EMS, the system of parliamentary democracy is a set of valuable rights gained by the working people through their struggles, right? And so this Namboodiripad himself being quoted. Our experience of working of this system proves that since the parliamentary democratic system as prevails today provides the exploited majority a powerful weapon with which to fight the exploiting minority. The latter, however, does its utmost to reduce democracy to a mere formality, to subvert it whenever and wherever the exploited majority uses it to get anywhere near the seats of power. So the communists are therefore in this particular situation in the unenviable position of having, on the one hand, to defend parliamentary democracy, but also to go beyond. So it's sort of to establish more, organizational structures, political structures and forms to, preserve whatever is the valuable, in parliamentary democracy, and but also to go beyond, right? So I think it's a very dialectical perspective, that the people like EMS sort of developed in debate, with all kinds of other people, even within his own party, right? Not every CPIM member, even in Kerala, was all, unambiguously in agreement or enthusiastic about this kind of decentralization. They worried, like, what if, the opponents gain power, right? And so on, right? So some were actually, rightly or wrongly, happy with the limited power that they were able to gain with the central state and the state, right? And and so on. So, but within this, EMS and, the Thomas Isaac and others, they were able to kind of have this dialectical, approach, to the state. So we have to work with the existing state, but also go beyond it, right? So it's this sort of balance, that I think is most striking, in this particular experiment, in the global perspective, among other things. So there's a lot more, I think I could say, but this sort of but there's also here the notion that there's it's a self-critical assessment, of the whole experiment. I think they celebrate rightly, quite justifiably, all the achievements as Ranu, enumerated some of them. But there's also the sense in the book that, this kind of, decentralization or the devolution of power to the local scales, 4 scales, in this case, is not kind of a panacea, it's not the solution to all problems, so for example, so they think that industrialization and infrastructural development required determined state level intervention, whereas the decentralized development strategy was more suited for the petty production sectors and for basic services. This is one of the earlier formulations in the book, so there's some kind of a division of labor, so what can happen at the local scale and what still needs under the prevailing circumstances, the intervention, the instrument of the state and federal levels, right? So it's a complicated, relationship to empowering people, at various spatial scales. So geographers will, of course, be interested in analyzing the scalar, problem in all of this, right? Okay, so one last comment, and then I will pass it on. So in the concluding sections of the book, there is I think a very interesting attempt to compare the Kerala experience with some other experiences of popular participation. So such as the Porto Alegre in Brazil, but also especially with the Venezuela of Chavez, after 1990, Chavez's election 1998. So one of the books that is mentioned here, which I ordered since I started reading this, but I haven't kind of looked at it very carefully, is like this Planning from Below book by Marta Haneke, which looks actually very interesting. It's written almost like a dissertation with many diagrams and tables and interviews and footnotes, but a very richly detailed documentation, like a comparative assessment, considering the Kerala, Venezuelan, and Brazilian, and some other Latin American experiences. And she herself is an intellectual and journalist originally from Chile, but was living in Cuba for a long time until she died in 2019, I think, right? So we can kind of place this Kerala experience in a comparative perspective with these other experiments as well, right? And well, the very last thing, I'm not going to say anything about this, but of course, as a planning professor, I cannot not ask this question, so where is this in our syllabi and curriculum? And is it, recognized by the Ontario Professional Planners Institute, this kind of reading as a essential skill, that we should tick off, when we come up for accreditation, by the professionals. Okay, I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanishka. Yes, I can wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment. Facing the same contradictions in my daily life as you do. Last but not least, we have Professor Justin Pudur, who is also a colleague of ours in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. You may have come across Justin in various kinds of ways, perhaps as a political journalist writing for Z Magazine or putting together blogs. For example, you may have heard of his Anti-Empire project, and if you haven't, you may want to check that out. You may not know that Justin is trained as a natural scientist, but he is. And even though he's been writing all sorts of other things, lots of books, mostly nonfiction, but also some fiction and nonfiction on books about Haiti, about Rwanda, about Venezuela. So he's most qualified to intervene in this discussion today. Justin, it's all yours.
I have one other qualification to intervene today, which is that I'm actually from Kerala. My parents are from Kerala. They came to Canada in the 70s via Germany. They met on a boat, I believe, going from India to Germany, or they met on a, I know there's a story that they met on a boat. My dad was going to be a priest, but well, he met my mom, and he was a social worker in Toronto for a long time. My mom, typical Kerala story, was a nurse. She was a nurse in Germany and here. And exporting nurses is one of the main exports of Kerala, actually, and has been for many decades. So yeah, that's my main qualification. And the other thing. So I was gonna say planning. Kanishka mentioned this, that there's a history of planning in India, nationalist, central planning. The figure that I would have you all look up is Mahalanobis. So Mahalanobis was born in 1893. So the first 54 years of his life were under colonialism. He studied mathematics in India, and then at Cambridge in the UK. And he became like a research statistician. He developed innovations that are still used. So if you Google his name, Mahalanobis, the first thing that'll come up is something called the Mahalanobis distance. There's also statistical survey methods. But when India became independent, Nehru drafted him to be one of the architects of Indian central planning, the 5-year plans. The first in this, Mahalanobis was the kind of like got involved heavily in the second 5-year plan. He brought computers. He wanted to bring computers to India. We brought India's first computers there in the 1950s. Created the Indian Statistical Institute to actually, and a lot of what they were doing with the computers and the statistics was actually trying to have the infrastructure to make the plans for the 5-year plans. So yeah, I'm glad. I wanted to just say that, like, I've been trying to say for the past couple of years that we would be better off not talking about the metaphor of a New Deal when we're trying to figure out what to do about climate change, because it's not a deal. I mean, when Roosevelt said that in 1932 or whatever, it was sort of an electoral campaign, like a New Deal for the forgotten man. But we'd be much better off talking about a green 5-year plan or a series of green 5-year plans, and we would be better off looking at those experiences of planning before planning became a dirty word under neoliberalism, whatever. Okay, so that's cool. I'm glad that we had an event that saying that planning was good. So now I'm gonna say a bunch of negative things because I think culturally as a Malayali, that's my job. I don't know how many of you know Malayalis, but like I'm going to play that role. So if you're familiar with our culture, you'll recognize that role, which is a little bit contrarian. But yeah, so India, this is all taking place in the context of India. Ranu mentioned the Punjabi farmers that won this victory, a defensive victory. They weren't fighting for anything new. They were fighting to prevent something. They weren't fighting to win something. They were fighting to stop something from happening. And they sacrificed 700 lives. They had to occupy this capital for a year, and okay, they succeeded, which is good, and it shows that Modi isn't invincible. So we have to celebrate that. But India is still hungrier than North Korea, according to some indices. North Korea being a state that is based on central planning, but sanctions. So I think when we talk about the fact that Kerala is inside India and this planning process is taking place inside India, it's important. There are two elements that are important. One is the limitations of being a province inside of a state, which means you don't have control over a currency, you don't have a central bank, you have to take whatever happens at the central level in those ways. foreign affairs, trade, all the elements of the budget that go to defense or whatever that disappear before any such thing. So that's, of course, a huge limitation on what they're able to do in Kerala. But on the other hand, if Kerala was an independent country, it probably would be under vicious starvation level sanctions, the way Venezuela or Cuba or Iran or Yemen or any of these list of countries is. And it would have been overthrown. The government probably would have been overthrown by now, or they would have tried. And when I said it would have been overthrown by now in my notes, I I kind of chuckled, because if you look at Kerala's history, it actually has been overthrown by the central government of India. There's a mechanism by which the central government can overthrow any provincial government, any state government in India, called President's Rule. And Kerala sets the record for President's Rule. Usually when or before or shortly after the communists win an election, they're overthrown through President's Rule. So it happened right away when they were first elected in 1957. There was 155 days of President's Rule. 1960, 206 days. 1964 and 5 for almost 3 years. 1970 for 60 days, 1979 for 53 days, 1980 for 51 days, and 1982 for 67 days. So Kerala is always being overthrown for electing these left governments and for trying to do these things. The other thing about elections, about India, before I say 3 other things about Kerala and then try to open it up. The thing about Kerala, I mean, the thing about India's electoral system now is, like, India has made me, I mean, the US or Brazil or even Canada should be enough to make you skeptical of electoralism as a what do you call, synonym for democracy. But India, the way that the government, the Modi party, whatever that thing is that's in charge of India now, the way that they have manipulated communal violence in a kind of a scientifically targeted way, where they stir up violence in areas where there are going to be elections in a way that seems to help them win the election. They do it locally, they do it with technological advanced methods. They do it with WhatsApp. They do it with collusion and help from US political operators. And they've done it now since 2014, and they've done it in all kinds of state races. They've done it in all kinds of, and then at the federal level, they won in 2014. They won again in 2019, despite 2 things: despite having delivered nothing from a development perspective and actually taken the country backwards, and despite a serious anti-incumbency bias that people, Indian political analysts always talk about, that Indians hate incumbent. They hate the incumbent. They always vote against the incumbent. And Kerala has systematically voted against the incumbent since the 1950s until 2021. So that's an interesting thing. Maybe 2019 people were like, well, we can keep the incumbent. So the left front was won for twice in a row for the first time, I think, in Kerala history. So just 3 other notes that I want to make before we turn it over. One is, rereading this book, it was just so striking to me, and it has again to do with this electoralism, where I almost long for a Cuba or a Chinese system where there's just one party, so that they can actually get things done without worrying that they're all going to be reversed, by the next time the right wing comes to power. I'm sure the right wing also has this. So, I don't want to give up. I don't want to just blow off elections here or anywhere else. But if you think about, there are limitations to electoralism, especially in the context of a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. People talk about Lenin's conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but what people neglect is that that he was also saying what we live under today is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So it's not like he's not saying like we're gonna end democracy and establish a dictatorship of the working class. He's saying right now this thing looks like democracy. It's not. It's actually the rule of one class, and we want to substitute the majority. We want to substitute the working class. So these are all just kind of some of the notes about electoralism. Another point is like the emphasis on decentralization in this debate. Decentralization, I don't think is a good or a bad thing. Like potentially it could give, in Kerala, I think in numerous times it's given more power to local actors who help you escape from a centralizing oppressive power. But the flip side is the local actors could be oppressive, and that happens all the time in India. There are lots of villages where the oppressive power is local and people need to escape from that and sometimes seek the protection of a federal situation. And then the last negative thing I wanted to say is, as great as the Kerala experience is, it's so different that it's really hard to see how much or what of that could be adopted or adapted from Kerala to other situations. The experience has been good in relative terms, but it seems to me if it could have been adopted, it would have been adopted by other states. And the left parties do talk to each other in India, and Tripura and West Bengal, those left governments lost. Despite having done some very good things too. So how generalizable is the so-called Kerala model? I fear that it might not be all that generalizable. Still very much worth studying, and a history worth studying for sure. I would never tell anybody not to study anything, but that's I guess I'll leave it there. A few controversies, and then we have 10 minutes to see what comes.
Great. Well, let's just check in on a time. Can the speakers all stay until about 1:15? Is that possible?
Sure.
2:15? Okay, great. We have another faculty event at 2:30, so I have to actually get out of here, but that gives us a little more time. Thanks so much, Justin. Of course, your comments also raise a very important question that is now all the rage in various debates in social theory, which is not only how can other Indian states learn from Kerala, but how can Northerners, like many of us, learn from the global South, right? And so that is the hot topic in urban studies and a lot of other places. And I think one should put that on the agenda, right? You raised the difficulty of doing that in a genuine way. I want to open up the floor for questions, but I want to start with one that I had, and I couldn't help putting it out there because Ranu raised it in one of her points, which is the question of caste and gender. And these are two issues that have indeed been raised critically by people in Kerala itself, including the work of Jay Devika, who's raised these particular questions in relationship to what she perceives to be a left developmentalism, CPIM left developmentalism in that context. So if there is anyone who could speak to this a bit more, that I would certainly be helpful. I would certainly be thankful as an outsider to these debates. But let's open the floor and maybe take 2 or 3 additional questions and see where that gets us. Does anybody want to speak directly? Or would anyone like to put something in the chat?
Aisha, in response to me saying it may not be all that generalizable, has noted that Kudumbashri has been adopted in other states. Some other good stuff too, for sure. Like even some of the decentralized enterprise models, some of the fair price agricultural stuff that is done in Kerala has been adopted elsewhere. So.
Right, Aisha has their hand up. Would you like to add?
Yes, I am actually a gender feminist and women's studies candidate here at York, MA. And I'm from Kerala, and my research topic is on Kudumbashri, which you were discussing. And I'm basically exploring the role of Kudumbashri in mitigating the impact of COVID-19 on women. That's like the rough my final MRP topic right now. So yeah, so I just wanted to say that, you know, Kudumbashri model has been replicated to other states widely, and there have been a lot of success stories. If you could just explore the media, like, you know, it's widely published in Indian media about how Kudumbashri is partnering with NROs, and also to my limited understanding, I'm still exploring more about that. I think some countries from the global south, and particularly some countries from Africa, is also coming, and, you know, Kudumbashri is given some kind of capacity development programs with some African countries as well. So I'm still exploring that. I'm still a beginner and still learning more about it. So I just wanted to note that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Pablo.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists. I learned a lot. I've been studying Kerala for much of my adult life, and it's nice to actually hear, you know, this regrounding, as it were, of this book. But if I can, I just want to read you a quote that, in a sense, goes beyond, not goes beyond, but is part of the same quote that Kanishka pointed to, and it's about the defense of parliamentary democracy at the central and state level, where it exists, but is very often threatened by the authoritarian forces. And its extension is to the district and lower levels as envisaged in the four-pillar democracy, and therefore of an extreme importance in the advance of Indian society. My faith in democratic decentralization, in other words, arises from the fact that it helps the working people in their day-to-day struggles against their oppressors and exploiters. So, you know, planning is a political economy, but I just wondered if the panelists could speak a bit more to the forms of protection, because as all of us know, you know, populism can also be decentralized, and as we know, not just in India but elsewhere, it's taken a form of, in fact, deconstructing various facets of the state while utilizing the state for authoritarian purposes. Justin, you pointed out to the multiple changes in the nature of incumbency. And I just wonder, what are the kind of protections built in to the polity side of the political economy, which of course has economic effects, in this kind of attempt to buttress decentralized planning?
Can I start?
Justin, you want to wait? There's one more person, and then maybe we can take all of them as desired. Xavier.
Howdy. I'll try and keep my question brief, but I'm just curious in what material or like what ways does the participatory planning in Kerala differentiate from like more conventional participatory planning that's like in the United States and such. I encounter a lot as a mostly working in municipal politics, like how all these charrettes and, you know, participatory meetings and stuff. And there's definitely, I feel, I almost call it like a trend to try and make that much more of a thing, but I don't see it really materially offer a lot of actual decision making to people in neighborhoods. It always feels like the decision's already been made before these participants, and that's probably one of the major differences. But I'm curious, like, if we do want to learn from this model and integrate it in participatory planning here in these kind of communities, what are the material ways to do so to make sure it is truly participatory and not just getting some input or create or manufacturing consent is really what it feels like most of the time. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions: gender, caste, electoral democracy, polity, political economy, and the question of participatory democracy, participation in planning. Who would like to jump in?
So I've been doing that my whole life. even since grade 1. So yeah, I think the third question others will take on. I would say one big difference is that it's a lot more chaotic in Kerala, and that actually it works to the benefit of the people. Like it's you know, a design or charrette or whatnot here would be super slick. Like, I mean, we know from our universities, like you have this participation process that's manipulated from the beginning to the end. They know exactly what they're presenting and what they're going to do afterwards, but they want that kind of rubber stamp, right? So in Kerala, it's chaos. Like there are things that anything can happen a lot of the time, and that actually leads to what I would say to Pablo too, which is the protection in Kerala is like constant mobilization and constant agitation, you know, of all kinds of things. Like there are some of the in solidarity with the farmers' protests, there were some of the biggest like human chain demonstrations and marches of like hundreds of thousands of people in Kerala. So it's just like there's an element of like, if we can do this over this, you know, you should also not get too many ideas about like trying to take things away from entitlements away from us in you know in state terms or like rolling back terms. So those are the, I'd say that's like the protection, and there is, you know, that tradition of like of agitation and mobilization is also hard to, it's not easy to repress that locally anymore. I mean, you know, things can always change. And then the first question, oh yeah, no, and then what Aisha was saying about Kudumbashri. The one thing I'd say about Kudumbashri, which is like, I think of that as not like an answer or an alternative to state welfare schemes or state anti-poverty schemes, but I think of it as an alternative to microfinance kind of stuff. And this is like Kerala's take on microfinance, which means that it's a lot better. It's a lot better than the kind of microfinance schemes you'll see elsewhere in India that are run often by foreign NGOs.
Thanks, Justin. Who would like to go next?
Hi, Stefan.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, I was just, do you want to go first, Ranu?
No, I was just going to respond probably to your previous question on gender as well, that the other two, I completely agree with some of the comments that, but that the other two countries that you were looking at were Ethiopia and South Africa, which is probably where Kudumbashri, aside from 6 states in India that have been using it as a role model. But on the question of gender and caste as well, I think what is quite well evident here, and I guess I could speak a little bit too about maybe a little bit on Bengal, but particularly in Kerala, is the state's long history of social mobilization and strength from that. And that history, right from the, you know, what Justin referred to, and also later part of the 19th century, of nationalism, of trade unionism, of socialism, of communist movements, that kind of transformed and sort of had a different kind of vision and a reformulation of social relations. And so that, in terms of thinking about sort of class ideology and how that might have related to caste relations, and is very much, had a very much of an influence based on that historical precedent. So that's what I was going to say. And in terms of the decentralization and protections built within, no, I completely agree. And I think there's a whole chapter in the book as well, which talks about the limitations of decentralization in different parts of the world. And different kind of models of decentralization, and right from the World Bank and so forth. So I think what's really important, what the preface of the book really starts off saying is the context, the social, economic, and political context is really important to keep in mind as the basis of the ideological basis of understanding how it evolves. Of course, on the ground, there are challenges as well that relate to gender, and other kinds of spatial and other kinds of challenges that come about. But in general, it's a very different kind of ideological base compared to, and I'm thinking about Cuba as well, where the social structure and political structure that form, which is an anti-capitalist structure, which is a very different model of decentralization than another kind of neoliberal kind of understanding of decentralization.
Thank you, Ranu. Greg, Kanishka?
Sure. I'll just make just a couple of quick points on one, partly following from Justin and Pablo on democracy. I think the question really isn't, for me, it's never been about electoral democracy per se. It has to be treated with all its inequalities and limits as capitalist democracy. The problem with eliminating liberal democracy within capitalist states is the alternative with no democratic things, and what has been the forms of regimes that then emerge within capitalism without liberal democracy. The history of them is very authoritarian, very fascistic, and very nationalistic, and all the rest of them. And they limit the terrain. The question has been the sucking of all energies into electoral democracy without any kind of extra parliamentary struggles is the issue, and fetishizing elections and electoral democracy, and especially, now that it's electoral democracy is such, a void. The ruling class wins whoever's elected. There's hardly any options on the table which aren't ruling class options, as in our elections. They're all three variants of ruling class options. In that sense, it's an instrument to preserve maybe minimal kind of civil liberties that have been struggled for, but it isn't kind of an option around the economic or social alternatives. That's at that level, it's just bullshit. I think the problem with decentralization has to be put also of decentralization without kind of any centralized power to compensate. That is, the capitalist class loves nothing more than decentralization. In many ways, for many terms, because their concentrated power allows them to engage in competitive bargaining with decentralized locales without any kind of, if there isn't any kind of compensatory centralized power that's able to kind of limit and curtail some of that power. So decentralization is a good and sense of participation, but it might be a participation on a weakening foundation. Which has been the nature of all local participation structures under the regime of neoliberalism, because they're negotiating under worse and worse conditions with more and more concentrated capitalist power, and therefore you can't give up some struggle over the central state, the national state within capitalist societies, where power to some extent is legitimated and concentrated. They have to go together. And that's why I think urban planning structures in North America, in most places, are the bureaucracy representing themselves to the people, and there's no kind of active participation, and the bureaucracy's already discounted the competitive bargaining coming from capitalist interests and whatever's being proposed. There's no sense of the people demanding accountability from the bureaucracy and supporting some of the administrative functions to popular participation on a continual basis. So, ours are just, our exercise in consultation at whatever level, our exercises in legitimacy and legitimating the existing decisions that have already been taken.
Thanks, Greg. I mean, if Kanishka, if I may just add one. No, you go ahead. Kanishka, go ahead.
Go ahead, Stefan.
No, that's fine. I just want to add something to Greg, but later. You go ahead first.
Okay, yeah. So basically, yeah, I think I just wanted to say, like 2 or 3 months ago, I had the privilege of listening to a discussion organized by the Left Forum on Kerala planning, which was sort of presided by the two authors of this book, Thomas Isaac and Richard Franke. And in fact, I managed to type in a question on the chat, and it finally got to them. And it is similar to maybe what Pablo is asking about, but also some of the other issues that have come up. So my question was basically, why, like, how do you deal with people like who are diametrically opposed to CPIM politics at the local levels, where so these processes, if they empower everyone, it's also going to empower your opponents, right? And this was actually one reason why there was a quite considerable hesitation about this kind of decentralization and devolution of power even within the CPIM itself, right? And so Thomas Isaac's response was very clear, like this is not something we are really that worried about, because especially at the local level, it's we are very confident about having a debate with people and coming to the right kind of agreement, and so this was, I'm just quoting his response, the gist of his response. And but I would add also that, like, there's some kind of hesitation on the part of some people, and also especially like EMS Namboodiripad, to kind of call Kerala a model. So he says, don't actually call it a model, so it is a movement, right? So he prefers the word movement to the word model, right? And so it is a kind of, this signals the fact that, okay, there's no like formula here that can be kind of applied here and there and elsewhere, but what it shows is a kind of a process, like a process of really, political struggle, of a struggle for empowerment. And and in another response to another question, or somewhere in that presentation, they said the most significant achievement of the whole experience was, I quote from my notes, it awakened the political consciousness of Kerala's workers and peasants. So this is the thing that, you can't really kind of tabulate or measure, with statistics, so it kind of raised the level of, political awareness and consciousness and made people participate. And that in some ways the most valuable and lasting contribution, right? Of the fundamental contribution, and but I do take very seriously another issue that is addressed in the book in the context of the limitations or the self-critical part of the book, that all of these ideas about the decentralization, participation, and all that can be co-opted, and they have been co-opted, by the World Bank and very mainstream kinds of planning institutions and dominant interests, basically. And but again, the question is, because of these kinds of co-optations and corruptions of the process, is it an option for the left to say, okay, we don't want this? I think, at the end of the day, it is, our, like, in my view, like, the left standpoint is should be one that, okay, we are still committed. Yeah, at least this is one message that I got from Thomas Isaac, that we are committed to the process, because as long as we are in this movement and process, like, of kind of democratization, and empowerment, right? And there's no kind of way around it, no shortcut if you're serious about socialism or communism and power to the people, right? So So in various contexts and places, okay, this may happen differently, but it is there's I think it's a bit dangerous to think that there's a model, but it's more productive to think of it as a movement.
Yes, we have another question, but let me just add to this crucial point by Kanishka following Greg's earlier. I mean, because there's also a question from one of my students in the chat to the same point. I don't think, certainly from my point of view, the point of this panel was not to do what the authors of the book say we shouldn't do, as Kanishka says, which is to look at Kerala as a model, right? The history is not some kind of shopping mall where you can grab things and put in your basket. Unfortunately, however, that's how lots of people look at it. And I think we have examples of this, not in relationship to Kerala so much here in Toronto, but in relationship to participatory budgeting, right? I mean, the Brazilian example, which certainly had promises in some respects in the 1990s, and was a more modest example of people trying to develop participatory strategies in relationship to social mobilization, in relationship to building counterpower, and in relationship to building capacities to consider strategies of social transformation, right? Where participation is not a thing, it is not a technique or a tool, but it is a contingent element in a broader set of processes. I think as Ranu pointed out in one of her 4 points, right? Participation as a part and parcel of social mobilization. And I think that's a good method to look at, the pros and cons of participation. Is participation an element of that, or is it not? That seems to be very useful. Here in Toronto, in the Toronto district, when the Toronto Housing Authority, and for a brief period, Miller's mayor's office, used public participation, participatory budgeting in Toronto, it was really not different from what Greg said earlier, which is it was a way for the bureaucracy to present itself to the people, right? It was not part and parcel of a process of social mobilization, let alone transforming the balance of power in political dynamics. And I think we should be very careful in this respect not to start mining Kerala for things to plug into, little edges and crannies and nooks of politics in Toronto, for example. Anyway, that's just sort of my perspective on this, similar to Kanishka's and Greg's. Sanil has a question or a comment. Sanil?
Yeah, I actually just had a comment because my work was completely based out of Kerala. I'm still in Kerala and like been in Kerala for quite some time. So what I've generally noticed is that when you're talking about local self-governments, all the members, I'm talking on a very local level, the elected members, they're also not from the same party. So even when there is a particular party, for example, presently the Communist Party is in power, but in the local government, you will find that there is a mix. There is at least 2 or 3 parties which are having their members elected into this local council. And they automatically have a like any proposal that is going to come is going to have a good amount of debate before it comes across and is implemented in this particular local system. So that is there. But that also kind of, the chaos is the word for that also, that there's a certain amount of chaos which is created because many times in certain, certain areas or certain regions, you may find that the larger seat is won by the communist, but the local seats or the local region, local smaller areas are managed by different parties. So there's always an amount of friction between this particular setup. So there'll be a lot of protests. There'll be a lot of, many things may not get done in that particular scenario. But in many situations, there is also a good amount of debate. There's also a discussion which comes across, and many of these schemes are also observed and reviewed by the concepts which come from the the central government, which was already being discussed, the central government is going to announce that their focus or their budgeting is related to certain avenues. So this would be coming all the way down to the local self-government, but the local self-government would also focus on their local problems as well. So many, so there is a lot of layers and a lot of situations which are local, state, and then central. So these things are all at play at the same time. So it's very difficult to kind of see Kerala and then say that many things from here are like immediately cannot be taken back. That's what I think, which I've seen in the the local setup, and there's a good amount of uh, details and levels and nuances which need to be kind of mapped or discussed when we are talking about this particular system where it's happening. And to clearly say, Kerala has very good social indicators in terms of literacy, in terms of human development, and all those things are very high. But then there are other factors which are also very critical in terms of its economy, in terms of its the fact that it has like practically very less industries. So a lot of contrasts are there. So whenever we are studying Kerala, that's what again and again, because this is whenever I'm expressing Kerala in terms of research, in terms of writing, this is again a big issue that it's very difficult to explain a lot of factors about Kerala, because Kerala has a big mix and it's part of India, which is another big mix. So there are two mixes, and there are two mixes which are in contrast with each other as well, Kerala versus the rest of India also. But having said that, again, there is a good amount of things which are happening politically, which is also kind of creating the second term of this particular government is also kind of another factor which is now focusing on a new set of developments, which is very independent. And Kerala is facing a lot of climate change issues. I don't know if you are all noticing that. So many new things need to be done environmentally. Probably Kerala would need to invest a lot to kind of take care of itself. So the focus may have to change in the new plans which are coming up on the local level. So I just wanted to quickly add that comment, because that may not be, because that's something which you would see on the ground level, that how the plans are formulated. And practically you would have 3 members from one party, 4 members from another party, 7 members from the ruling party. So there'll be probably a good fight happening in the local self-governments, while any small scheme also has to be announced or has to be kind of formulated into a project. This is a usual event here. So yeah, that's all from my side.
Thank you, Sunil. This is getting us very close to the end. Any final comments from the panelists to wrap it all up?
Sure, I had a comment and a question kind of for others, then maybe the people could answer after me. One of the things about the models, there's a book that's so popular that's kind of just full of that sin, which is Eric Olin Wright's Envisioning Utopia, which is full of kind of these examples pulled from everywhere and kind of then articulated as models that are incrementally changing capitalism and tilting towards socialism. And it just kind of has this sin with presenting these without the context they emerge in, the class relationship, class forces. It's baffled me since I read this book a decade ago why it was so popular. It's a catalog of things that kind of can't be replicated and so badly told in terms of the catalog, they kind of just mislead what can be done, which is different from what I think you can get from places like Kerala, and the fact that we do grow in different places from learning from other places, and that is you kind of learn, you get ideas, you think them through, you integrate them within the struggles that you're engaged with a particular place, and you experiment, in what places like Kerala or whatever are pleased for increasing experimentation with, in your own case, and learning from doing rather than kind of an attempt to abstract. I think I think there's a really, really prominent example through the 20th century of the problem just to impose models, and that was the way that the models of the Soviet Union were just replicated in multiple places from above, as if they could just replicate it. And the central planning structures of India, for example, also suffered from some of that in the post-war period. From not being contextually specific enough from what was being advised from the Soviet Union at the time. The other thing is I was struck by the book, but also any discussions that Kerala have had about this is a question I always had for those of you that have kind of been more embedded and know this much more than I do. And that is the relative lack of participatory workers' plans over kind of major sectors. Workers' plan, developing plans from below and kind of being able to push it. It's quite obvious when we're dealing with small enterprises what's being done and the encouragement that occurs and the support from the central state. But these larger questions of kind of workers' plans to challenge kind of capitalist organizational structure, financial decisions, et cetera, not the kind of the phony consultative process that occurs in the council's processes in Germany, for example, but real kind of struggles over investment decisions and the organization of firms over and what is being produced in companies. And I know nothing about that dimension of Carolyn. I've never read anything that looked at that question.
Well, there certainly are a number of cooperative experiments, right, for both agricultural and manufacturing, but maybe somebody else can speak to this in greater detail. Kanishka, you wanted to add a final comment?
Yeah, it's just that, like, maybe just on this point, not a direct response, but I think the idea is that the stuff from the below, what is coming from the below deal with, okay, if I can quote from page 64, like the right to shelter, education, healthcare, safe drinking water, and other basic needs. So it is kind of, some of the stuff that we might kind of group under some notion of the right to the city kind of stuff, no concept, is very much part of this, but at the same time, I think, one has to also understand that, this kind of decentralized planning cannot do everything, so there are some things for which, you need a higher scale, the intervention at the state and, federal kinds of levels. But my general comment, last thought was going to be like, as interesting as these experiences are, I think it is also important to kind of focus on the years and decades that actually create the conditions of possibility, for these experiences, so for me, like, it is the period from 57 to 97, that is really interesting, like equally interesting in the book, because, there are so many, so the ideas of all this decentralization, devolution of power were there from 57 onwards, at least in Kerala, right? With the first election of the CPIM. And, but what is interesting is, in spite of a series of attempts, to enact legislation and set up these institutions, they were systematically, dismantled and thwarted, by the ruling powers, right? And at all scales, so it is ultimately a long history of popular mobilization from below that actually even got this started, got it going, like in the 90s, right? With all the criticisms and limitations, right? And the constraints. So, but we can look to have a similar perspective on, Venezuela and Brazil and other places where anything comparable has been possible, right? So without that history of mobilization and movement, to consider these as models, without that kind of historical background, and enabling conditions of the, enabling conditions produced by these political movements, our perspective becomes very limited. That was my last thought. Yeah.
Well, I think that is exactly the kind of conclusion we need. Thanks so much for the panelists. Thanks so much for everyone for the questions, comments, for attending. On to the next event. Have a good evening and have a good weekend.
The next class struggle.
Yes.